Afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to you all. It's lovely to see so many people here this afternoon for our conference on net zero game changing, and a warm welcome to everyone joining online as well. I'm Jennifer Baker, a policy journalist based here in Brussels, and I will be your moderator today. We will have some opening remarks, some opening speeches, and of course the presentation of that all-important report before going on to our panel discussion. We will also be using Slido. You will see here in the room QR codes that you can scan to get connected to the Wi-Fi, and I will tell you a bit more how we're going to do that a little bit later on. To those joining online as well, be ready with your device to go to slido.com, and you can enter the code CO2 there to join more manually. So we'll also have questions from the room if those of you want to do it when we get to the point of the panel discussion. But we're going to hear first of all from our hosts today, Eurocommerce, of course the association representing European retailers and wholesalers. We will hear from Oliver Wyman's representative, who have done the report, of course, and that report is seeking to answer three key questions. What is the importance of the retail and wholesale sector for Europe's race to net zero? What is the composition of the sector's greenhouse gas footprint, and what are the implications of decarbonisation? How can net zero be achieved? What actions are underway? Limitations and success factors going forward. And then we will take all of those considerations on board. We'll hear from the European Commission what they think about it, and then we'll have our panel discussion. So that's the layout for today. I'm sure you're all eager to hear more about the report, so I'll hand you over to the Director General of Eurocommerce, Christelle Delberg, to tell us more.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, everyone, for being with us in person and online. Very warm welcome from our side. With our planet experiencing the accelerating impact from global warming, climate change is demanding urgent action and collective responsibility. Today, there's a growing consensus amongst the business community, politicians, and society who see this among the biggest threats to the global economy, making sustainability and decarbonization critical priorities worldwide. Today, our planet faces significant evidence of the impact of accelerating climate change. This from the faster than expected melting of Greenland's ice to spikes in droughts, floods, deadly storms, and wildfires, and everyone today can relate to this. Time to act on greenhouse gas emissions is now. To avoid unpredictable changes to our ecosystems, the European Union has set ambitious targets for 2030 to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 55% from 1990 levels, and to reach net zero by 2050. 2 years ago, in a study that we did together with McKinsey, we estimated the investment needs for our sector's direct carbon emission reductions to be in the range of about 300 billion euros by 2030, while our sector operates on very narrow margins. While the investment needed for Scope 1 and 2 carbon emission reductions are easy to define, or relatively easy to define, how to tackle Scope 3 carbon emission and their reduction and the cost related to this raises a number of questions. Retailers and wholesalers hold a unique position in the chain for collaborative action on climate in the value chain. Every day, our sector connects hundreds of thousands of producers with hundreds of millions of consumers, and they play a role in facilitating net zero ambitions. Europe's retail and wholesale sector value chain carbon emissions adds up to 1/3 of the European Union's total carbon footprint. But the study that we're discussing today finds that only 2% of these are Scope 1 and 2 emissions, so 2% only is directly linked to our sector. The majority of those carbon emissions, so about 98%, represent Scope 3 emissions, originating in our sector's value chain. This includes, for example, the transportation of raw material and products to markets, their manufacturing, as well as emissions created when consumers use and dispose of products. Sitting at the nexus of this ecosystem, retail and wholesale plays a pivotal role in facilitating lifestyle and business model changes towards greater sustainability. It is our hope that the study we're publishing today will not only serve as a useful resource for practitioners in the value chain, but it will also provide policymakers with relevant insights. By targeting both audiences, we aim to foster collaboration and drive meaningful change at both our sector and the policy level. The challenges posed by climate change require collective effort. The study seeks to empower stakeholders across the full value chain with data and analysis that will allow everyone to take decisive action towards a more sustainable future. We particularly thank the Oliver Wyman team, led by Rainer, who will be our next speaker, and Circo, who have contributed, and Eurocommerce and our members and our team who have contributed with the expertise and the commitment to make this exercise possible. Their invaluable insights and the commitment to sustainability have been instrumental in shaping the report. So together, let's embark on a journey towards a more sustainable tomorrow of responsible practices, innovative solutions, and a greener global economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, and we will of course hear from Christelle again a little bit later on. I did promise that we would get all the audience involved, so before we let you ask questions, we're going to ask some questions of everyone here and of course those joining online. We're going to use Slido, so you can either navigate using your phone or your device to slido.com, or you can scan that QR code there on the screen. If you decide to navigate yourself, you can put in the code CO2. And that should take you straight to our first poll question, which is, how can the retail and wholesale sector best contribute to reductions in Scope 3 emissions? You've got a multiple choice there, so please vote, and we will come back and have a look at the results of your voting after we've heard from our speakers. You have agreement on common and specific measurement standards, improved end-to-end value chain collaboration, increased strategic priority and investments, green technology adoption and innovation, consumer information and education, or other, which I guess leaves it wide open to you to interpret. But we'll come back and have a look at that after we've heard from the report presentation and from the European Commission. So let me hand over now to Rainer Munch, who is partner and head of retail and consumer goods for Europe at Oliver Wyman, with 20 years experience in consulting on and advising retailer and wholesalers on strategy and transformation, including, of course, sustainability. Over to you.
Thank you for the introduction, and also on behalf of Oliver Wyman, welcome to this event. We are very excited to share the results of our study with all of you. And obviously, as Christelle also mentioned, this is not possible without teamwork. And before going into the content, I would like to share with you the team that has been driving this as a cooperation between Eurocommerce and Oliver Wyman. And it's been a pleasant collaboration, and it's also been exciting to see so much passion on both sides going into this report, and I hope you can also sense it when you go through it. But it's not only been this team that has been fundamental to creating the report, but also many Eurocommerce members helping us along the way, providing insights, inputs, case studies, best practices, but also challenges on this journey to create what in the end is a sector perspective on especially Scope 3. Obviously, as Oliver Wyman, we often do studies like this in collaboration with various entities I must say that in this specific instance, I was overwhelmed and really excited about the level of passion and commitment and excitement that we received from all the contributing members. So I think it underlines the fact that this is a topic that's not only important from a brain perspective, but also from a heart perspective. And as a father of 5, I also am very keen to improve the foundations for this planet to survive as long as it can. However, the starting point, and it's also to some extent reflected when we look at the latest results of the EU elections, is a bit sobering. We have surveyed more than 400 top executives across the globe on what are the top aspects that they have on their agenda. You see growth, you see AI, you see product, customer, and others. But where's climate? Well, it was also mentioned, but pretty late. So it was only 5% of executives that put it among the top 3 strategic issues they are seeing for the near future. This has been different in the past, and it's also surprising when we look at the context in which we are currently living. Many of you have followed the news around floods in Germany and other places. Global warming is felt in more and more places. And then there's CSRD. So also from a policymaker and regulation perspective, there's more pressure on companies to think about emissions and think about climate control on their end. Which is also what gives us confidence that the snapshot that I showed earlier about the current perspective on executives will not be there for very long. If we reflect on the various stakeholders that play a role around retailers and wholesalers, be it the consumers, be it investors, lenders, employees, NGOs, governments, competition, and also other value chain partners, in every element we find evidence that there is a requirement around climate and emissions control and also an increasing relevance for decision-making going forward. So that gives us confidence that what we present here, what we discuss here, will soon be back up in the top 3 of many decision makers across the globe. Now to the first question we looked into as part of this report, which is, what is the contribution of the retail and wholesale value chain to the European carbon footprint? And if we look at the total, then we have a starting point of 4.9 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalents for Europe from a consumption-based perspective. And when we now look at the contribution of the retail and wholesale value chain, then we come to a staggering 1.66 gigatons. So it's really a very significant contribution and a very significant role that you all and the sector plays in the total emissions perspective. Now, however, if we look deeper into this, then we find that 98% of that 1.6 gigatons is actually scope 3, which means it's not in direct control of retailers and wholesalers. Only 2% are. Only 2% are in direct influence. 98% are not. And I will dive deeper into this 98% in just a second. What's also part of the initial situation is that when we look at these 1.6 gigatons as of 2022, how are we looking towards net zero by 2050? Well, if we take what's currently reflected in measures and planned policies, then we can only close the gap by 2050 by 40%, which leaves 60% still of the 1.6 gigatons unaddressed by what we can currently foresee and predict. Quite a significant number and share, which also calls for action. Now coming back to the 1.6 gigatons and the breakdown for retail and wholesale, then you see it's obviously different by sector, and you have way more than the majority in food and beverage and health and beauty, and you have more than 70% in scope 3 upstream. So that's all that related to supply and upstream logistics until basically the products are in the stores. What you also see here, what's interesting, is that when you think of consumer electronics, then only 1/3 is in scope 3 upstream. And almost 2/3 are scope 3 downstream, which is related to what happens after the purchase of the product, which just highlights also the very different perspectives that are needed across the value chain to consequently address scope 3. In consumer electronics, it's a lot about how to inform and influence behavior after the purchase, in how you use devices, in how you deal with energy at home and so on. Whereas in food and beverage and others, it's a lot about the production side and the global supply chains involved. And then also a bit like the elephant in the room when we talk about food and beverage and scope 3 is obviously agriculture. I think in the end, tackling this big carbon footprint all in all is not possible without also considering the agricultural side of things. More than 70% of the emissions in food and beverage are linked to land use in agricultural production, which is obviously very relevant. Now, taking that as the status quo, the question is where to go from here as a sector. And we think there are basically two choices. One is, one could look at this and say, not our problem. 2%, we take care of it, we'll work on it, we're not really responsible for the 98%. We're getting it either from producers or consumers. We're just the middleman. Or you could take a perspective that looks more at the opportunity and a broader responsibility for society and nature, and really see the retail and wholesale sector as what it is, a platform, as Crystal you also highlighted, connecting the supply chain with the customers, a platform that is well used to communicating to both ends, and a platform that can have a very positive influence on both ends in informing consumers on the one hand, and in also taking along the supply chain and helping in standards and in improvement along the way. And we're happy to say that there has never been a question when we worked on this report, neither from Eurocommerce nor from the members that contributed, that the answer should be on the right side. And there should be a positive influence and a positive contribution that goes beyond the 2% scope 1 and 2. That's not the only good news in there. Another good news is that a lot is happening already. The 10 case studies that we have embedded in the report are just one reflection of the many things that are being done by individual companies, by associations, nationally and internationally. And you will find all of them explained. So we have a positive outlook, we have a commitment to play a role, we have many companies and associations already taking some steps. What are the big challenges and what's the dilemma? And when we looked at the data and scope 3 specifically, it became clear that it starts at the very beginning. It starts with the measurement. Here we're looking at the question, what are the emissions linked to a cotton t-shirt? You ask 7 parties, you get 7 answers. And the answers are not close, but they're very different. And that is the fundamental challenge at the moment, because none of these answers comes from someone who wants to be wrong. everyone tries to get it right. But when you look into the details, it quickly gets quite complicated. So what can explain such large deviations? Well, on the one hand, if you imagine a brewery factory in Asia that has a certain energy consumption, what's the underlying energy mix? What do you assume? Do you assume it's the one that this particular factory uses with photovoltaic panels on the roof? Or is it a regional average? Think of big countries like India. Or is it a national average? What do you take into account? Then if you look at the transportation, do you look at the specific transportation of that product, how it comes to Europe and your stores? Or do you take an average? Say, on average, these are shipped by plane or by road or by sea, and take that emission. And there's many more questions linked to that. So there's chemicals used as an input in a process. Are they part of scope 3 or not, and so on. And this is why we see so different answers. And we also see, when we later talk about maturity levels, that the lower the capability level is of companies, associations dealing with that, the more they have to rely on data providers. And data providers, in turn, tend to take the average of the average. And that's what you start with, which is not bad, but it just can be very different to what others are seeing and using. And also, I think later in the discussion and in the conclusion, we'll highlight again how important it is to tackle this methodological question, even if we fully acknowledge getting this right is not reducing carbon emission by even the least bit. It's just about foundation. So what are then the success factors more holistically if we also go beyond this foundation? So calculation methodology I pointed out. Once this is aligned on, you still need access to the data. If we agree that if we did agree that the best thing is to measure what's really happening at a plant level, and you as a retailer and wholesaler should use that information and report it, then you need the data. Same as if you think of a cotton t-shirt downstream, what is the usage behavior? How often is it washed, at which temperature, which energy mix? What is the consumer behavior after the purchase of a television, of a hi-fi set, whatever? There's a lot of data you need, and there's support needed from the suppliers, but also policy, context to make that work. Then there's also a question around the framework, the regulatory framework. Many things are already happening, but in the study work we also identified there are several gaps, contradictions, and there's also quite some uncertainty around pre-competitive collaboration, what's allowed, what's not. And some of the questions will require more collaboration across company and sector borders. Then once the foundation is set, next success factor we see is really decarbonization, really getting carbon emissions down with current technologies to the extent it's possible, but then also find a context and an ecosystem that supports innovation and technology breakthroughs which are needed to get to net zero at one point. And then it's also taking the consumers along, informing them, helping them, supporting them in decision making. And last but not least, it's also on a company level important to optimize and enhance the ESG operating models and also to intensify collaboration. Now, picking up on the operating model, as part of the study, we also looked at the maturity level of companies in how they have set up their emissions management. We see different levels of grips on the size of emissions. We see variation of tools, of steering culture, actual engagement, and also strategy and commitment to the public. And as part of the study, by the way, you will also find a questionnaire allowing companies a self-assessment along these and the sub-dimensions. When, as part of the study, working with selected members, we analyzed total of 22 entities, we found the following distribution, so that really 33% are already leading the path and are really advanced along most, if not all, the dimensions. But on the other hand, we still found 41% that are rather at the beginning, and this with a sample that is certainly not representative, because it's those who are engaged, who are doing something, who are contributing here. So we think that if we did a more representative perspective, it would be much more on the lower end. So there are still things to do on a company level, and we think going forward this needs beyond all efforts on a sector and policymaker level. It also needs to happen on an individual company level to advance how emission control is managed. So, to close, I think status quo, very significant emissions, 1/3 of Europe from a consumption-based perspective, 98% scope 3. To get to net zero together, there's work needed on the foundation building, on the decarbonization, and then also on the implementation on company level. We still see room to improve on a company level in terms of capability enhancement and operating model. And there's good foundation for hope, many best practices we identified and also shared in the report. And with that, the question will be, can we get to convergence towards net zero together? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And of course, Werner will be joining us for the panel, and I'm sure many of you will have questions for him. But as you mentioned, none of the actions and none of the results we've seen from that report happen in a vacuum. The European Union has a commitment to cut emissions by 55% by 2030, and there's of course reporting requirements from the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. So we know the European Commission policy people have been listening and paying attention. So I think it's very timely that we have Daniel Mess, who is a member of the Cabinet of the Commissioner for Climate Action, Wopke Hoekstra, and has been in particular advising on the Green Deal to Frans Timmermans before as well of that. So please, Daniel, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, and many thanks also for having me. It is indeed very important that people who work on the climate policies once in a while literally come down and speak and look at all these challenges. And actually, supermarkets, retailers, offline, online, it's always a very good and important audience to speak to. One quotes the economist Milton Friedman. He once said, "The best invention in life that was never patented is the supermarket." It's a big game changer in our lives. We should actually be happy that the idea was not patented, because if it were to be patented, we wouldn't have had the competitive space that we have now with many supermarkets. And I qualify the offline and the online in there. Everybody knows how important this consumer-facing business is. I'm also a regular customer of the same supermarket. I like the consistency of the offer and the quality, but do expect as a consumer that it meets and exceeds my expectations on a continuous basis. And actually, it goes a bit like that in climate policy too. If you look at the politics around climate right now, where we're having first-hand experiments, what it means if a national government, for instance, tilts a bit more to the right after the elections, I still think that consistency is the pattern that emerges. Consistency in terms of the climate targets. Jennifer already mentioned them, but 2030 minus 55%. Lots of companies have prepared for that, have invested in that. And also the political parties that are now being part of a right-wing government don't want to throw these investments away. They don't want they don't want to see them going into a dead corner. So you see also with these political coalitions emerging the desire to be predictable and stable in terms of the targets. The second thing that one sees, I think, and that is the challenge that I think is more relevant today, is that, okay, so clarity and consistency in the targets, but the coming years will be about more simplicity in the execution and actually making sure that our companies, including yours, have the ability to deliver on those targets. And that part of the equation is just as important as these climate targets. So in that sense, your study really comes at the right point in time, in the turn of a political cycle in the European Union, where the second question will become very important, because that is what is behind the big words: competitiveness deal, competitive sustainability. People use different words for the same thing, but it is really about that. Like the next years will be about the simplicity in the execution to make sure we reach that timeline 2013 and going beyond in 2050, which is the other legally binding target that we have, being climate neutral as a continent by that year. And there is indeed no space where there are little spaces where this challenge becomes as visible as in the supermarket or the online sales platform that we all use, because that's where the low carbon products need to end up on the shelves, and that is where the consumers need to buy them. So as Christel already said, you are pivotal, and your number also showed that despite the fact that lots of efforts are needed elsewhere, it's all channeled with all these tons through our supermarket shelves and our online rayon in that sense. So you are a very important interlocutor there. Now then I get to the study itself. I think that everybody, also policymakers, see the unique position that you're in, and that unique position goes both ways. On the one hand, the challenge is a lot of it is channeled via the shelves to the consumers, but in order to lower the emission count, we depend on many actions that happen elsewhere. In that sense, you're a bit in the same situation as the European continent going into climate negotiations, where Europe is responsible for 7% of the emissions and also needs to work on the 93%. But just as we are internationally leading the pack is a good way and a good strategy forward to make sure that you also get results elsewhere. Now, I think that the study, and I read it entirely actually, so all the 80 pages before going in there, which also means that you've created something which is an easy read. So that's also really good. What I particularly like about the study is that it doesn't only outline the challenge that members of Eurocommerce in this case face, but it also has a few grains already in there for the action to take. These 10 best practice examples, those are the ones I read most carefully actually, because these are the things that happen on the ground which should inspire policy making in the coming years. So my first takeaway of that would be threefold. In the first place, yes, we need to look at these type of examples and see how across the economy what is happening already and people cooperating with each other to bring these sustainable choices to consumers, and how to make sure that we learn from that and then steer the policies and the investments going in there. My second is a bit of a word of warning that I don't think is even necessary, but it's good to say it. Don't see this as an excuse to demand that all the SMEs and the farmers start solving your issue just because they're responsible for a big chunk of the 98%, because I think that is not the way that politics will work. If you look at the farmers, to stay with that example, I think that one of the main gripes of the farmers with climate policy was that no matter how you turned it and which policy lever you tried to pull, the bill ended up with them. Because people said you need to produce more sustainably, you need to create biodiversity, and there was no work on actually making sure that they get a reward for doing that, so in a business case. So in that sense, it is important to keep the dialogue open, and I'm not saying that I don't think that this warning is necessary, because if you look at these best practice examples, people see the issue. But don't take it as an excuse that you can only look elsewhere to solve this issue, just like I cannot look only elsewhere when I see that you face this challenge. And the third one is, let's try to make the best use of the time that we have right now to make sure that we do look at these best practice examples. People that have online tools to make sure that small suppliers can only register a few basic details, and then you have digital solutions, including AI perhaps in the future, that makes a very accurate calculation of the greenhouse gas emission reduction. I think those type of things are very important to get the policy right, and to make sure that we do the best we can to make sure that everybody in the chain has the right business case, because the good thing about the study as well is that it goes beyond the measurement challenge. I don't think that there's any policymaker that wants to keep you in measurement purgatory forever. It might be for some of you measurement hell. I don't know if you work on these things in practice, because the measurements, we don't measure in order to just measure. We measure, of course, in order to see where are the big stakes, where are the challenges, and which actions are necessary to get there. And I think that with that reasonable mindset, we both need to look at it, also from the policymaking side. So here is something that at least my commissioner thinks it is very important, that we learn from examples how things can be done simpler, including for smaller players in this chain, and then to see how we can adjust the measurements that we ask on that basis, because again, measurement does make sure that what you measure, make sure that it gets done, but nobody should get stuck in the coming 5 years until 2030 in just making the measurements work. The action field is really important, and in that sense, I really want to thank you again for this study, and this is just a first reaction with 3 points. After 1 day of reading, I will make sure that also all the colleagues also read it carefully, and then let's make sure that this is also like an open dialogue also with you and your members on how together we get there. There is stuff happening on the ground, so I'm pretty sure that together we can actually make sure that the supermarket, it is the nexus of where many of these choices come together, but ultimately changing the world requires businesses, innovation, technology, and then the policy coming together. So let's try to work on that basis. But thanks a lot for all that work.
Thank you, Daniel, and you're going to stay with us for the panel debate. Before I invite our other speakers to join us, let's just have a quick look at the poll result, because you were talking about measurement, and I don't know if we can see it on screen, but I can see it on my tablet, that is far and away out the most important point, that the most important scope that people have voted on. So it's agreement on common and specific measurement standards. 37% of you who answered said that that's the main way that the retail and wholesale sector can best contribute to reductions in Scope 3 emissions. Around about 20% said improved end-to-end value chain collaboration and increased strategic priority and investments. Fewer people then said green technology and innovation, fewer again consumer information, and only 2% suggested it was other, meaning that we've at least clarified the areas that are of most interest. But agreement on common and specific measurement standards, almost 40% of you voted for that. Let's now invite Reina back on stage, please, to take part in our debate. And we're also welcoming to the discussion Nick Lacken, who is Group Corporate Affairs Director at Kingfisher, meaning that he's in charge of government affairs, industry and NGO relations. Nick, please grab a seat. We have Quentin Badonel, who is Head of Environmental Impact at Decathlon and has more than a decade's experience in developing logistics and sales packaging solutions in France and Taiwan, and specialises in eco-design. And then, unfortunately, one of our speakers couldn't join us, but we have stepping in, thank you very much, Astrid van Paris, who is Sustainability Manager from Colruyt Group, and Astrid is responsible for developing and implementing the sustainable strategy and governance, including ecological and societal impact. So thank you very much indeed, Astrid, and unfortunately Agatha had to send her regrets today, but we know that we have a capable panel here. Let me start, Nick, Quentin and Astrid, with you. Our overarching question for this panel, we're trying to understand how we tackle Scope 3 emissions in retail and wholesale at a very basic level. So tell us what your impressions are of the barriers, Nick, and also maybe a first initial reaction to what you've heard from the report and from the Commission.
Okay. Well, look, I mean, thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Oliver Wyman, for a really good report that really brings together the entire sector. So very quickly to explain, I'm from Kingfisher. So we're a UK-listed business, but we're very live in 6 European markets, including France, Poland, Spain. And we're all about home improvement. Now, our sector, as I said, it wasn't the largest, but it had a pretty large footprint. And we've been working on our own scopes 1, 2, and 3 for some time. We have approved science-based targets, which we would see as the gold standard. And clearly that instantly identifies that your scope 3 is the biggest part of that. So then our team in our offer and sourcing side, and we're lucky, I suppose, because 45% of all the products we sell are our own exclusive brands. So that gives us a different relationship with our suppliers as well. So in terms of what we're doing, the first thing we did, we surveyed our top 100 suppliers in terms of carbon footprint. And that provides some insights in terms of the scale of the challenge, I think, because slightly less than half of them have some form of published plan, and of which of that 40-odd% it is, only 5% have science-based target aligned plans. So that means that more than half of the supplier base with the biggest footprint may be doing some work, but they're not talking about it publicly. So there's clearly a responsibility on us as a large retailer. How do we work with them? So we've developed our own roadmap. We've got a series of KPIs. I can unpack pieces of that further, but tries to break it down into 4 large chunks. So areas like improving our product energy efficiency, all of which involves working with suppliers. But fundamentally, the challenge with this is we can have great intentions as Kingfisher, we can have great plans, we can start working with our suppliers, but we're only one of a number of people, a number of players. And where it gets really lucky for us is our sector is a global home improvement industry. So we have a group that comes together, it's called EDRA GIN, the case studies in the report, but it really does bring together home improvement retailers from all over the world, from the Home Depots, top 5 global retailer, through to Kainz in Japan, Sodimac, South America, Bunnings, Australia, South Africa. So we've got everybody coming together. So what we did last year is we launched a global Scope 3 retailer task force for our sector. And then last week was our annual get-together with over 1,000 people, 700 suppliers. And at that point, we updated, and there were 2 new steps there. We launched a strategy document, and in particular, a Scope 3 accounting guide for our sector. And then we also, at the same time, because it was a joint conference with suppliers, there was also a supplier task force that was set up, which mirrors the retailer task force. The big but to all of this, and this is exactly why we see it so important to come together, and I think this builds on a number of points made, is the vast majority of our suppliers are SMEs. So clearly, if you're a very big multinational supplier, you're going to have a sophisticated Scope 3 program, you're already working on it. But lots of the suppliers are between 10 to 40 million euro turnover businesses supplying a number of different players all over the world. So if we don't make their lives easy, they run the risk of their businesses becoming unviable. And that really doesn't help anybody in the long run. So that's the journey we've started now. And clearly, we're at the start of quite a long way to go as well.
Thank you very much, Nick. Quentin, let me come to you. Same sort of question. Talk us through what you're doing, where you see the challenges, and a little bit of background as well, please, on Decathlon, although I'm sure those in Brussels know it quite well.
Yeah, I have the pleasure to represent Decathlon today. So most of you know Decathlon, but some of you don't know that we are more than a retailer. So for the last 50 years, Decathlon has been a retailer for sports equipment, but we have the chance to be not only a retailer, but also designer of products. We are producing the product that we design. And so we are really at the core of what you presented in the report, in the middle of consumers and production, so the supply chain. And so we have the chance, being there in more than 50 countries, selling our products, to propose the offer of tomorrow and to use the supplier that will be the more efficient regarding the Scope 3 emissions. So what we have done as a journey for the last more than 10 years is start to eco-design our product. So how do we take our responsibility as the designer of products to identify the most efficient raw materials, select them, source the suppliers of those materials. Then we also have to engage our suppliers on phasing out from coal. It's really clear. It was a very clear strategy that has been aligned with the UNFCCC. So we have organism like this, where we can have strong commitment as a whole industry. And it's very efficient where we have this kind of strategy aligned with the sector, so we can have a clear message to our supply chain. So phasing out from coal was one of them. Switching to renewable energy also. So this was the three main actions we can say that we started with: eco-design, phasing out of coal, renewable energy. And now another challenge that we will have to embrace to reduce the scope 3 emission basically is to go to more circular business model in the coming years. And this will be a challenge that we will have to step in. We discussed with Unique about this just before. It will be very important also to embrace this new challenge for retail sector.
Thank you. So Astrid, to you, talk us through Colruyt. Of course, you're a Belgian company. What are you working on to reduce scope 3 emissions? Give us some of the broad outlines of your perspective.
Okay, thank you so much also for having me. Indeed, we are a Belgian retailer, and we have quite some stores and quite some products. That has a specific character of us, because we are also not only a retailer, we also have own production, we also have private label, which just gives us the same advantages, I also believe, because you have more impact with regard to your private label, and we have always put private label first. And I remember when I entered the organization in 2011, we have already been working on carbon footprinting since 2008, which gives us a very vast base on where the complexity is, where the hotspots find themselves, and how we also have a broad, very broad and carried out support from our own management, which I believe is also very important to also know what is footprinting and what should be done. And then if we look at scope 3, what I believe is very important is in our sustainability strategy, we have made 3 great areas. One of them is the consumers area, and of course, if you can change, or you can help also to change the insights from consumers, why their behavior should be changed. That is also a very big but a very challenging point to do. So what we did is to introduce the Eco Score in order to give more information to our consumers with regard to more information on their consumer behavior and the products that they're having. And then secondly, what we're also doing is the same as Decathlon, I believe, is working on the product itself in broad collaboration with our suppliers, and also very much in the beginning of the value chain with farmers, with suppliers, and so on, making sure that we have long-term standing relations. We're also very helpful, because you need a lot of trust and a lot of loyalty in order to do this. I think things cannot be changed just at once. And it's something that has been going on for a long time and takes a lot of efforts, and also must be seen in the complexity of it, because you cannot change climate conditions if you cannot also change the social conditions. And that is something we really look at as a whole way of making sure that products, behavior, people are taking into account. So that's very much more like the way we look at it.
And quite a holistic approach.
Exactly.
I'll just remind you in the audience again that we have got the Q&A open now on Slido, so if you can put questions in there on your smartphone if you're here in the room and don't want to stand up at the end, or online, feel free to do that. Rainer, just briefly before we get into some more of the nitty-gritty, you give us the outline of the results of the report. Were there anything surprising or unusual that came up, anything that's you weren't expecting?
Well, as mentioned before, I think a positive surprise was really the level of engagement and passion across the Eurocommerce members, across sectors, companies, associations. So I think that was a positive surprise. I think also a bit of a surprise was when we really went down to the nitty-gritty of Scope 3 calculations. I think the complexity was even greater than we had anticipated if you cut across the sectors, and I mentioned a few of the drivers. So it really is hard to imagine what's really down in the machine room if you look long enough, yeah.
So let me then, Daniel, come back to you. You've heard a lot about what the different organizations represented here are doing, and we're going to talk about what advice. I mean, from your perspective, where can the Commission support businesses in going forward?
I think that everybody said, like, I think the Commission should dare to learn a bit more from what is happening on the ground, but also help in, because it's often also about connecting the dots. And to give you a very concrete example, if you look at a very big technical investment, like a big fertilizer production site, I don't know if you've ever been to one, but these things are really humongous, these sites. And then we have, because we think it's strategically important, an investment in technology that captures CO2, that is used in the process, stores it and transports it. With that, you can produce low-carbon fertilizer. And low-carbon fertilizer is, whereas it's 3 times the cost for an individual farmer, it's a few cents on the price of the breakfast cereals that are actually produced and end up in the supermarket shelves. So I think that's a prime example where supermarkets, retailers, farmers, and the big technical site that does the CO2 capture can get together, and where the Commission can then help, for instance, by having a low-carbon label that you can use across Europe, saying, okay, if you used this fertilizer with that technical procedure, your breakfast cereals are low carbon, because in that way, because that's the challenge with consumers. Consumers, on the one hand, it's super important that they're well informed, and I always applaud all these very easy to understand eco schemes, but ultimately consumers also want to just see things fixed. They just want to see products that are sustainable at a competitive price. So I think that's one of these examples where the Commission can really help, also connecting some of the dots.
And Nick, what would you like in return to see coming from policymakers?
Well, I mean, I'd kind of build on the first point there. There's been some lovely phrases in this conversation about, you know, eating elephants and measurement purgatory, which I particularly like. And Christelle made this point about facilitating lifestyle changes, and I would throw in what I call inconvenient truths. And the inconvenient truth is consumers worry about this, but they really worry about the affordability of their lives instead. And so certainly we've done a lot of research from the home improvement sector. We know if we talk to people about energy efficiency in their home, water saving in their home, that all sounds good. When you talk about money, it makes a bigger difference. And I guess then I've got kind of 3 points for any commission, any government to be thinking about. The first is that point about a consumer-first mindset. And accepting that kind of limited consumer appetite. They do expect it to be taken care of. They expect you to do the right things. If you're not cost competitive, if you're offering something but it's a premium cost, you're generally not going to purchase it. So that's the first point. The second is I think there's some very tangible areas. So I'll give one simple example. Peat, which is a subject that the UK seems to care about a lot, but a lot of Europe is relatively passive on. And yet peat, so it's the stuff that's in your garden. You know, whenever you're growing anything, peat can be great for growing your plants and your vegetables and your fruit. But the problem is it's the largest natural terrestrial carbon store there is. It's about 5% of all man-made emissions. And if you take that out of the ground, you are causing untold levels of carbon impact. So a simple, and it's not an easy win because, again, like everything else, there are winners and losers and consequences of this, and change is going peat-free seems to be a very obvious piece. And then I think the other bit, though, just taking a step back from something very kind of big, tangible bits of the elephant, is that geopolitical consequences. How does a CBAM for Europe, the UK, really play out in this geopolitical kind of and heightened tensions when, yeah, the supplier's footprint from China may be double the carbon, but the cost is probably half the cost of being manufactured elsewhere? How do you tackle that?
Well, I should say in Ireland we're quite exercised about peat as well.
Which is great.
Yeah. Astrid, coming to you, I see you nodding along there. I'd like your thoughts on what Nick is suggesting in terms of effecting change.
Yes, we are a Belgian retailer, maybe big in Belgium, but maybe not on a European and not even on a global level, of course. And yes, it's not easy for consumers, and they also trust that their retailer has the best, most sustainable offer to make and the best, most sustainable products to offer. And that's not always easy. And an idea, a setting for collaboration is something that is very important. We're doing a lot of effort also with our Belgian suppliers, but also on an international level. You need some extra support, some encouraging some encouraging measures in order to look together at specific challenges in order to create more and generate more effective impact. And might also repeat the idea, it's climate is part of the environmental, and next to the environmental you have the social, and it needs one coherent approach. Because sometimes there's a lot of legislation also coming up, and it's also important that these kind of initiatives are also harmonized and also looking at the same angle, and also making sure that very much the result is in order to improve conditions for everyone in the chain that is involved, in order to make that offer possible of durable, sustainable products towards the consumer. So again, it's a whole story, it's a holistic approach, and it needs to be guided along the whole way, and it should be feasible and simple, as you already said, for everyone that is involved.
Well, Quentin, before we come back to this global dimension, let me ask you on a sort of practicality level. I know Decathlon, you've outlined, has done quite a lot of work, but what advice would you give to a company if it's just at the start of its path? We saw there from Rainer's graph very clearly there's some 40% or so that are really only at the beginning stage. Where do they start? I mean, and where do they get the advice? Is there peer-to-peer sharing there?
Well, for sure they will have to measure, okay. But we don't want them to spend time here on identify the best methodology. Yeah, you said it. We have to get away from this debate, and so applying the most recognized standard is a first step, and use tools available on the market for measurement, very important. And so get out from the measurement methodological debate, first point, and discuss with peers to identify the most winning strategies to tackle the various stakes that we have to address. It's not only climate change, you said it. We have to embrace the full scope of environmental impact, biodiversity. If we save climate change but we don't take care of biodiversity, we will lose everyone. So it's not only measuring climate change, not only measuring biodiversity, but getting to a consensus of what are the most winning strategies, knowing the technologies available on the market. And so discussing with peers to validate what are the most winning strategies we all have to invest on is a must to do for the industry. Then collaborate with the institutions on changing the regulation to incentivize the deployment of those strategies is key. It's very key, because if we don't have regulation, if we don't change the rules of the market, we will continue with the cheapest solutions, not the solutions we have to deploy as a sector. So we need to collaborate with all the institutions to get to those incentives by solution deployment, not only measurement, but the solution that the institutions want us to deploy. It will be very key. Otherwise, you will put the responsibility of saving climate change to the companies and the customers. And so you will ask them to pay more if they have enough in their pocket to do so. So it will not work properly. And finally, I said it at the beginning, but we have to collaborate also on closing the loop of circularity. And to do this, as a retailer, all retailers have to experience and share what is efficient, what is not. And we have to align on connecting all the retailers that we are. We have to close the loop, and we know that a product that Decathlon sold, we will have to capture it again in our system to make it accessible for another sport user several years later. And so we need digital solution, digital passport, for instance, to capture and to ease the circular business model. So these are the topics to invest. Deploying the most winning strategies and solving circularity's challenge for the future.
Well, I think what all of you have said about consumer elements is reflected in our unscientific Slido poll. Only 9% of people thought that consumer information education was one of the key ways to reduce Scope 3 emissions. So there's at least a little bit of joined up thinking there from what we're hearing on the panel with what people are thinking in the audience. Rainer, to come back to you on the corporate angle, are the very largest retailers and wholesalers already doing absolutely everything that they can? Is there room for improvement? Talk us through where low-hanging fruit versus going that extra mile come into play.
I would say that many are already doing a lot. And as I mentioned, the passion, it's not only passion, but there's also actual investment. And we see significant teams driving this. We see investment in methodologies, in projects to improve. We have some examples in the report around funds put forward for innovations and really help. So I think a lot is happening there. It's not true for all the big companies, so I think there's some catch-up to do for some and some reprioritization potential. But currently, it's not fully synced what the big ones are doing. And there's the opportunity to have also more alignment of those at the forefront, to even align more on the very same direction, because others will follow.
Daniel, let's come back now. It was raised by Astrid to this global, if you like, geopolitical point of view. I mean, this is a global question. And I'm wondering, how can the Commission support a decarbonisation agenda in particular sectors where the production takes place well outside the EU with a very long and very complex supply chain? Where do you put your finger on the lever, as it were?
Yeah, but that comes back to the main question that, like, for this all to really work and on the supermarket shelves to have like the food and beverages and the beauty products, I now understand is also the second thing that we might have to have a closer look at. You need then to have these solutions at scale, so that these solutions are ultimately affordable, and that the retailers can generate the volumes with them to make their own profit. And you clearly do that in a geopolitical world. You do that in a bigger space. In the areas where we see, okay, you can't produce these low carbon products at scale like fertilizers or steel, because that is such a global marketplace that if you force the Europeans to do sustainable and the other ones on the cut, it's not going to work. For that, we have what you mentioned already, this border measure that you check the Indian steel coming in, like, does it face a CO2 price like the Europeans, and then you calibrate. And for the ones that the markets are a bit local, fertilizer is a bit more local in terms of like the clientele. Cement is also a very local business there. You can talk more about how do we create the right lead markets to make sure that these low carbon products get off the ground. But none of that is super easy. But I do see the political consensus to try and get there, to make sure that what we demand of businesses that have the low carbon products, that we don't only demand the legal things that we require, but that we really have a look at their business case to make it happen. And I think that will drive things forward, because again, doing it at scale in a way that you're not outcompeted entirely, I think that's the solution to make sure that supermarkets can still make the right profit themselves.
Well, I see a question here online that's related to our discussion around the global emissions. Bertrand from Decathlon, one of your colleagues presumably, is asking, what is the trend of our sector regarding global emissions? If we look back 5 years ago, is it better now? Is it better now than it was then? Rainer or Nick, would you like to take that one?
Well, I can comment from my own company that our trend is going in the right direction, but that's because we've set some targets a while ago and we've been working on them. And it goes back to Rainer's narrative about the Scope 1 and 2s. And Scope 3, we've had a science-based approved target for Scope 3 for some time. So go in the right direction, but it's not just about what we're doing. Just one other point I'd come back to on Daniel, which I think is so important from a Brussels-based perspective, is the point about enforcement. And that is, there's the power of the single market, which should provide lots of massive opportunity for the EU to drive something really positive here. But if it's just rules made and then it's not enforced at an international or national level, then it's not going to work.
Well, here in Brussels, we talk all about the next mandate as being the enforcement and the implementation mandate. We'll see whether that plays out in practice, but that's certainly the direction of travel that we're hearing across all files. Rainer, let me come back to you again. And ask what your experience in the current finding is from an SME angle. How will decarbonisation affect SMEs, which obviously have fewer resources, a smaller footprint in some ways, but also more hurdles in other ways?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I think there's no way to avoid it for SMEs going forward. I think it will trickle down from different sides. So I think that's just a reality that's happening sooner or later. But then, as also has been mentioned several times now, I think it can only ever work with a simple solution. And I think with the opportunities provided by digital tools and by simple templates, cockpits, I think there is a way to make that happen. There are promising pilot projects in some places that make that work, where SMEs, farmers can actually access easy online tools, enter a few manageable data points, and basically fulfill their requirements. And I think more of that will lead the way in the end.
Daniel, let me come back to you. And you mentioned it in your opening, but what about the agricultural debate with farmers? To reduce Scope 3 emissions, it goes without saying, and the emissions in agriculture have to be addressed as well, as they're part of the supply chain. Is the current direction where some environmental rules are being trimmed down a threat to the whole net zero agenda? And have the recent elections shifted on that?
No, like that's of course now the $1 million question, because when you look at it, like the trimming down of certain of these regulatory requirements is of course also by von der Leyen herself encapsulated in a broader discussion, a broader dialogue. It is probably a sector where there's a need for a vision that's a bit longer than the next year, so to say. So I don't know, a 10-year, 15-year perspective, because it just takes time. We all know it. The farmers, it's not like just five big multinationals. It's a very diverse landscape, and I think that I would personally only see that change happening if there's a business reward for the farmers in doing the right thing. And I always call that the Ben & Jerry's model. The ice cream maker who has decided itself that it wants to have a sustainable production of the ice cream that it sells, and we all eat it, so it's not overly expensive. It rewards the farmers for that because it generates the volumes that they need to make a profit. And we need to learn a bit more from that type of experience, like what triggers were there that made that model successful, because that's the only way to get there. So you need to do that obviously then in a way that you create the scale, so that in the supermarket stuff still stays competitively priced, so that people can use it. But without that business reward, I don't see a discussion on CO2 pricing for farming really happening.
Astrid, let's stay a little bit focused on the Green Deal. I mean, what do you see under the Green Deal? Are there rules that are clearly helping you, or is there anything that you have concerns about? Give us your thoughts.
I think surely the Green Deal is helping a lot. It's also based on the principles of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is also very important, I believe. The whole principle of making sure that you all progress towards less or to a better impact on climate, but also making sure that no one's left behind. So I'm sure that the spirit of the Green Deal is extremely important, and also all the attendance and all the specific rules in making sure that there is more transparency between companies in order to make sure that you make the same progress and you make sure that you have the same rules to follow. Which I believe might be still some room for improvement is specifically a safe zone, as I said, in order to experiment, to make sure that you can also learn by doing, because that's the whole reality of a retailer. I think the whole idea of measurement, carbon measurements, harmonized methodologies, making sure that all the data that is exchanged is also done in a safe way. These kinds of initiatives really would help us out, and also not only saying what cannot be done, but also helping us out by encouraging stimuli would also be very helpful.
I'll take another question from Slido because I see there are dozens coming in and we probably won't have time to get to them all. But Stephen Wynne-Jones has said that many retailers highlight their achievements in tackling Scope 1 and 2 when it just accounts for 2%. Is the sector focusing on the wrong targets? Obviously not the whole sector, but where do the value of tackling Scope 1 and 2 fall into this when we are today saying really it's Scope 3 we need to look at? Rainer, I'll let you talk about that.
I think there's no harm in tackling any emission, whether it's Scope 1, 2, or 3. I think it's progress. And also what can be a bit confusing is that the Scope 3 of this sector is the Scope 1 and 2 of the other sector, right? So it's addressed on multiple levels. So I think if every party makes real progress on 1 and 2, it's in the right direction. So I think it does make sense. But yes, the greater lever is the bigger challenge, is Scope 3. So I think we'll see a shift over time because it will get harder and harder to make further significant improvements on 1 and 2. So I think it will be a natural shift in terms of focus anyhow.
Nick, just to be a little provocative, sometimes there are complaints that wholesalers or resellers bully their suppliers. And can Scope 3 requirements be conceived as another bullying towards them? Is there a danger that will be perceived in that way?
If it is, I don't think it's going to work. And I think we're going to have a load of other problems as retailers if we get into that situation. So we've, certainly if I speak for the home improvement sector, we've been, and as Kingfisher first of all, it's very much about the co-creation and development. And what we've done with our own suppliers is, for the top 100, we've agreed where they will set SBTI aligned roadmaps and targets by 2028 for the top 100 with the biggest carbon footprint. For the next 450, it's by 2030 with the same principles. And then for the kind of tail, then that's about a plan by 2030. So in my mind, it's certainly about collaboration and co-creation and how do we help them to decarbonize. I was just going to, so no and hopefully not, and I think it's a big problem otherwise. It's back to that, you end up destroying a market of SMEs, and that's not good for anybody at the end, including consumers. Just to say on the Scope 1 and 2, I mean, I'd just say also it's the ticket to the game. I think you don't have any credibility to go on about your Scope 3 if you haven't sorted out how you're sourcing renewables, etc. So I cast my mind back to my own business. Poland has a massive carbon footprint. We have a big business in Poland. We made a very deliberate decision to source 100% renewable. We knew it was an additional cost. This is about 5 years ago. But we said, well, that's credibility before you start getting into the Scope 3 arguments. So I think that's about a kind of conscious decision as a larger player.
And Quentin, let me bring you in to talk to us about how that affects competitiveness.
It can if we don't have the incentives or if we don't have the same rules on the market. So that's always debate we will have to discuss with the institution and all the sector. How can we switch to what we have to do with the same rules for the market? So being too pioneer on some points make us on a difficult situation, and so we have to go together as a sector. And this is where the peer-to-peer discussion have to be aligned on this point, and where the discussion with institutions again have to be focused. Yeah.
A specific question to you, Daniel, asking what is being done by the Commission to ensure a safe pre-competitive environment? What is being done by the Commission to ensure a safe pre-competitive environment? I'm not sure entirely what's meant by that, but tell us what you're doing to enhance competitiveness for the whole industry.
Legal collaboration.
Ah.
How do we ensure we don't run against competition?
Oh, yeah, right, because I got a bit lost myself about what a pre-competitive, pro-competitive I know, but like
pre-competitive.
But like my distinguished co-panelist says, it's about the scope to share best practices across a value chain, whether you then fall foul of competition rules or not. Well, if you take the area of measurements, I think that's exactly why it's so interesting to see these examples listed in your study, where you have a bigger player in the chain having an online tool from an external provider or itself, where it takes in information from the suppliers, and then I think in the future you can even have AI then calculating all that footprint. If you do that, you don't have to go into all these spreadsheets and asking for confidential information for all your suppliers, and everybody has to see what the other one is doing. So I think that it is an important thing to take forward, this discussion, because like if people are afraid that they would violate a rule by doing the right thing, then our policies, we need to have a discussion on that. My hope is a bit that a solution like that is something that could help, because it also really helps with the SME issue. Because again, I think that it's just not fair to work with spreadsheets and asking the butcher and the baker to give all their scope 3 emissions. But, by the time that they finish with that, they're not selling bread anymore. So I think that that is a typical area where we need to discuss, but where we can also certainly learn from things that are happening in practice, because you call it the implementation mandate. It sounds a bit boring, but but it is actually really about the business-friendly way of doing this. So this is the typical area where we should also just listen and see what's happening on the ground, and then be inspired by it, hopefully.
I'll try not to be boring in future, Daniel. Another question. Joanna Inglis is asking, what are the major barriers, apart from cost, to incorporating more renewable non-fossil materials in products and packaging, for example, bio-based plastics or polymers? Anyone want to tackle that? Daniel, perhaps from the, or Quentin, perhaps from the point of view of eco-design, where do we see difficulties that might be overcome?
Can you? Sourcing the proper suppliers who have the capacity to deliver the required materials is the first challenge. We have to find them. We have to know exactly what kind of raw materials also we want. And the challenge for eco-design especially is to address climate change, but all the other stakes we have to address with even less clear scientific consensus today. So sourcing the suppliers that have what we can say the less challenge sourcing of raw materials. So identify what makes consensus today. Knowing that, we have still some doubts about, is it a good solution for biodiversity? Is it the best solution available for social rights, etc.? So this is very challenging for us as designer of products to have clear targets, knowing that we are on a moving playground here.
Nick, you wanted to add something?
I was just going to use a simple example of a lawnmower. So, if you've got a relatively small garden, then electric lawnmowers are pretty good at this stage. But the problem is they're a little bit more expensive, and if your garden's medium to large, the power's not there yet. So that's a simple example of a technological evolution. And also, there is a piece around the cutting size where an electric lawnmower doesn't have as big a cutting width as a petrol-powered one. So there's some bits where there's just kind of technological evolution that I think we've got to get to. I was just going to mention on the SMEs, the other point about why I think a lot of this work is actually helpful for the SMEs is you don't want 100 retailers all going to the same supplier saying, give us your carbon data in a slightly different way. And that's where, again, you have a separate, so in our case, we work with an organization called Manufacture 2030, who are partnering with a lot, and they act as a separate data holding, and it's one common place. So there's other solutions like that, which I think are also helpful to SMEs. It's not just about what big businesses want of small businesses.
I'm going to group a couple of questions together here now, and Astrid, perhaps you might be able to tackle this one. Someone is saying, our diets have a significant impact on climate. What can retailers do to nudge consumers towards more sustainable, low-carbon, affordable foods? And someone else then, both anonymous, is saying, how do you make those sustainable products more affordable compared to unsustainable products? Which carrots, not literally, carrots or sticks to offer manufacturers and retailers or consumers? And I'm conscious as well that we've already said we don't want to overly burden consumers.
These are a lot of questions in
well,
whole.
yeah, but they're all sort of interrelated,
sure.
and I know you've got a 360 vision on this.
I understand. The first thing that I'm just going to talk about our practices. The first thing that we're doing is making that you have the clear insights that Carbon footprinting, environmental footprinting is also combined to more commercial insights. So if we shift specific product categories, what is the impact on specifically on the products itself? Having insights, making sure that you're making the right choices. Secondly, what we also need is a sort of a strategy to work upon. So yes, the idea of making sure that products are more sustainable is also very much in line in what we're doing with regard to consumer behaviorism. Not only informing consumers, but also making sure that we have a clear goal towards protein shift, and also making sure that we have a clear goal towards consumer behavioring patterns to change them. So these are all these kind of things that we work on upon at the same time. And what we're doing is also try to communicate more, report more on the initiatives that we're taking, and also the effect that we're having. And I think that's mainly our approach.
Rainer, I mean, what's your take on this in terms of getting consumers on board? And looking at that from the point of view of different sizes of organizations, they've different relationships or different proximity to the consumers.
So first of all, we think that the consumer angle will play a very significant role in the midterm future in this whole transformation, and it will be to some extent also a demand question coming into this more strongly. And I think if we did the same poll again as today, we'd see way more than 9%. Also, at the same time, I think the transformation can only happen by choice and not by force. So it needs information, transparency. I think what you shared, Astrid, around the eco-score is a start. And the beauty around something like an eco-score compared to the Nutri-score is that there's no obvious compromises on the product itself, or there's not less sugar or less taste in any way. It's just different supply chain, value chain behind it. And if, as a consumer, I have the option of two products, and one is A and one is F, and they cost the same price, I think the choice will become obvious and will be a nudge towards the value chain. At the same time, I said the price is the same. I think there will be situations where there is margin investment needed from players along the value chain to nudge that initial demand and to incentivize the volume build-up that is needed to then get it to an economical steady state.
I have a good question here. We've been talking quite a lot about peer-to-peer exchange, sharing best practices and so on have been mentioned a lot. Someone's asking, are there the sufficient platforms in place, I suppose, digital technological platforms, to do that, whether they're there on a European level or on a national level, or perhaps as a role for Eurocommerce? Daniel, do you know of any particularly hierarchical systems or not that people could refer to? And maybe Christelle, when we're doing your wrap-up, we'll get you to talk about the role of Eurocommerce. Or anybody else want to weigh in on that question?
Well, I mentioned Manufacture 2030 a second ago. Yep. So that's a cloud-based emissions data platform. So that's the one that we're working with in our sector, but I know other sectors use it. I think there is, I'm not sure AI is, everyone says AI is the solution to everything, and I'd love it if that was the case, but I'm just not sure we'll get there quite that quickly. So I think there's more efforts required as well.
Quentin?
Yeah, there are some solutions and some platform already for measurement. I said it before. There are already a lot of solutions ready to be used for every kind of company size. So this is quite easy for strategies and eco-design strategies. There are a lot to do to align what is the most efficient and what the market should expect for the coming year. So there is plenty of space for innovation and collaboration for the future. Yeah.
Just one more point I'd add to it. From the retail perspective, I think the difference I see if you think about manufacturing, politicians are very often happy to invest in large manufacturing partnerships, CCS initiatives for power stations, et cetera, But where's the platform, the pan-European platform initiatives in this sector, given that scale of Scope 3 challenge and it being a third of all the EU's emissions? And I wonder if there's more opportunity there for the Commission to collaborate across the sector in that space.
Yeah, I'm seeing here with comments regarding common available databases regarding emissions benchmarks, all that sort of things, I guess, lumped together into that data sharing point.
Yeah, no, like I think it's definitely an area that is really worthwhile also looking into. Talking about like this in general, like there is a reason why the Commission also like that data governance model, where indeed you have one external provider taking in the data, and then sharing that in a aggregated, non-anti-competitive way across the chain. And I would be happy to hear of examples where that is working in a sector, because that would be a promising way to look at. Because I do see indeed, when you talk about such a diverse sector with so many products, that this is indeed in high demand for peer-to-peer collaboration. So I think it's worthwhile looking into.
And of course, no one size fits all, it never does. Let's go to a final wrap-up round before we bring back Christelle to talk to Rainer on the closing. What are your key takeaways from the panel on how we can move forward? So we've talked a lot about problems, solutions, different perspectives, and try to tease out the differences between them, as well as identifying some common problems or common issues. So Rainer, you have a closing, so don't tell us everything now, but what's your key takeaway from the panel discussion?
Well, I'm hearing resonance for many of the themes in the study, really, around methodologies and alignment, collaboration, getting the consumer along, thinking holistically both in a company and across. So I think it's quite encouraging that there's a journey ahead and some alignment and clarity on the way.
Nick?
I guess we're kind of sitting here, I kind of imagine it being a book with two different covers, and we don't know which cover it's going to be yet. So there could be the good happy ending, or there could be the other side. And I think there's such a fundamental role led by the EU. Talk about facilitate change. And we talk about lifestyle change, but it's not consumers, it's businesses, it's big, it's small. If we facilitate that well, we've got a great book and a happy, positive story. But there's a lot of challenges along the way.
Quentin, I'll go to you because I'm going to finish with Daniel.
All right. What I get from the discussion, I really like the book finish possibilities we have in front of us. And so first, I'm very happy that we all agree on the huge challenge we have on Scope 3. It's quite new, and thanks to the job done around this report, it's very clear now that we have to address this topic. What is very clear in the report also is that there is a lot of uncertainty in our capacity to reach the trajectory we have to follow. And so collaboration is needed, both peer-to-peer and with the institutions, because the challenge is huge. Only for climate change, but there are other challenges also to address. So this kind of exchange discussions have to happen more often in the future to continue to this journey, because there are a lot to engage.
And Astrid, your key takeaway?
I've also worked upon the realization of this report, and I remembered that there were a lot of very agreement on what that needs to be done. It's also very much beautifully reflected in this report, and I'm just waiting for a joint platform to get started.
So, I think they're all rather similar takeaways. And before I come to Daniel, what's needed to do what you want? I mean, is it investment that we need? Who's on the panel saying yes to more investment? Nick?
Investment, collaboration, some degree of regulatory support and alignment, some degree of regulatory investment. Well, there's a few. I'm sure there's many more.
Okay. Astrid and Quentin, I'm guessing you're not going to say no to more investment.
No, of course
No.
not. No, more impact.
More impact.
Investment in order to create more impact.
Yeah, and so spend time on deploying the solutions that we know we need to deploy. It's key, and spending less time discussing on is it the best or not. We have to deploy the solution, so let's focus on deploying the solutions.
Okay. Daniel, a final wrap up from you, because we always leave the Commission to last, and I suppose the overarching question people from the industry want to know is, do you feel their pain and the difficulties? And also, and that's why I was rather leading them to say that the need for investment and where that must come from, and what is the next Commission mandate going to do to help them?
Yeah, first I want to stick with the book and then talk about like, we're sort of midway the book, let's do sort of like make sure that there's a happy ending. But like now that you came in, we're saying like, do you feel the pain of the people? So then I'm going to stick with football because that's also what we're all tuning in for nowadays. Clearly, the European Green Deal, this is only the first half. The first half was now played, and now the second half is requiring a different team setup and a different way of getting there. And I personally would like very much that the future of the Green Deal is not just purely this discussion of like regulating a problem or importing a problem and then regulating that same problem again, but really about all these initiatives that are needed to make sure that there's a business case for all of this that is happening. Single market simplicity are really key ingredients that haven't gotten the attention in the past 5 years, and I think they deserve a bit more in the next few years, alongside collaboration and all these data solutions that we talk about, because ultimately, if we really don't want to only regulate the problem, we really will have to make sure that we have this simpler and better business case, that we create success that we can export to the rest of the world, and that would be my hope for the future.
Well, thank you all very much for the very interesting discussion. That was quite wide-ranging, and thank you for everyone's questions. There were more than a dozen. I tried to group them together, so we managed to deal with as many as possible. But I know there were other thoughts and other questions that we just didn't have time for, because I'm going to thank Quentin, Daniel, Nick, Astrid. You can make your way back to your seats before I welcome... Before I welcome Christelle back onto the stage with Rainer, though, who will have a quick discussion about what we've learned, what are the next steps. Of course, you've got the in-depth knowledge of the report, and as does Daniel, because he's read it all. There's a lot of different points there. We touched on investment at the end, but we also heavily focused on why it's important to work together. But there's global versus local supply chains, there's upstream versus downstream. There's a lot of different moving parts, and not everyone works on the same thing. So Christelle, tell us the role for Eurocommerce and what's going to happen in the future, and Rainer, to give us your thoughts on what's next after this report.
You want to stand?
Don't move closer.
I don't mind.
Okay, let's take this discussion here. Right, I think what we've heard here was a super interesting exchange from different sector operators, different sectors within retail and wholesale, with lots of commonalities, but also some differences in terms of how they engage with the supply chains. Some of the supply chains, as you said, Jennifer, some of them are local, very local, some of them are global. The behavior of consumers depends. Some of it, price and affordability comes first. But there's also other aspects in terms of the consumer behavior, how they prioritize the products, how they use the products, how do they come to stores. I mean, that was one of the key questions in the discussions we've had, in the few discussions I attended through this. Also, what we heard from members throughout the whole journey is how they're getting organized nationally, locally. We see a lot of, we heard a lot of discussions amongst players on a national level, but also recognition that sometimes the suppliers are international, sometimes players are operating in different countries. So how do you create the bridges or the connections between countries in that area? So I think this exercise has helped bringing all these questions to the fore. For us, looking ahead, I think we will need to take a step back together with our members and reflect about what are the key findings and how we can help support the momentum going forward. My concluding remark was going to be, it's only the beginning of a journey. Today we've collected some of the questions, and it will be with us to see how we can offer the platform. So together with our network of national associations and also the good practices that are out there, how can we leverage that network, and how can we help serve as a platform for our members to help on that journey. Is it about collecting the questions? Is it about bringing the good practices and helping share good practices, helping identify, building on the commonalities? Is it also about leveraging the common knowledge and the good practice towards the policymakers? Daniel, thank you very much for being with us today. There's been a lot of questions in terms of what can we do in that pre-competitive space. So what is the scope for collaboration? Be that when we're talking about suppliers, when we are bringing competitors around the table. So how can we create that pre-competitive space to allow experimentation? And there, the conversation with the policymakers will be super important to make sure that we can encourage momentum. So a lot of, I'd say, a very strong basis going forward, and we hope we will be able to play that role in terms of facilitating and building the momentum going forward.
Well, little to add here. I would maybe like to pick up the picture that Nick created with the book with two endings, and the one book with the bad ending and the one book with the happy ending. And I would just like to stress again that the book with the bad ending is right here. We can grab it now. I think the book with the happy ending is at the other side of the lake, up in the trees. So there's just a lot of effort and collaborative effort needed to get there. I think I showed earlier that we are 40% what we can see towards net zero and 60% not. So I think it's just, while this is a great foundation to build on, there's just so much work ahead still for everyone, both on a company and collaborative level, and it will take a lot more than eating Ben and Jerry's on the way, but I think there have been some very inspirational examples and companies leading this, and Eurocommerce convening us all here together to have this discussion, have the Eurocommerce, have the European Commission present. Also, I think this is just the right way, and I'm aware of the challenge, but quite optimistic of the way ahead.
Thank you.
I think I really would like to thank you, Rainer, and your team for making this report possible, for facilitating all these discussions and exchanges. Without your support, we wouldn't be there. We wouldn't have that report. So a massive thank you to you and your teams. Also, a huge thank you to our members for being part of this exercise. For having played the game, exchanged openly, candidly, because without your expertise, it wouldn't be possible. And also a huge thank you for our team, who's also helped, facilitated the organization and provided the support. It was a super busy period of time with an end of mandate situation with lots of policy files underway, but you made it. So a huge thank you to you as well.
Well, there doesn't seem to be much left for me to say except to thank both Rainer and Christelle for their fine summing up. I will take Daniel's analogy of football rather than the book one and say, let's not miss an open goal. And if you do like reading books, you can find that report in print outside the room or online on the Eurocommerce website. It's a cracking read, according to Daniel Mess. We should get him with a quote on the cover. And I would invite everyone who's here in the room to join us for a coffee outside and follow up on some of those questions. And those online, thank you for joining us. The whole event will be recorded and will be available to watch later on in case you want to go back over any of the slides you saw as well. So thank you all very much and have a great afternoon.